Good evening. Hope you're all doing well today. We're learning Maseches Gittin Daf Ayin Ches. We're starting 3 lines from the top, and we have a little bit of ground to cover. So let's get started. We'll be stopping at the very last word on Ayin Ches and Beis at the 2 dots. Here we go. We had said that if he throws her the get, afiluhu ima b'mita, if the get is thrown and she's lying in the same bed, she still won't be divorced because it's his bed. Doesn't help. Amar Rava lo shanu el b'mita shelo. That's only true if it's his bed. Aval b'mita shelo. Had it been that in fact the bed was hers, then migureshes, then in fact she would be divorced. So if she owns the bed and then he throws the get and it lands in her bed, then she'd be divorced. Tanya nami hachi. We have a brisa like this. Rabbi Lazar Omer b'mita shelo einu migureshes. That if this was sent in his bed, she would not be divorced. But b'mita shelo migureshes, in her bed she'd be divorced. B'mita shelo migureshes. How can you say that? After all, we have a different halacha that kelev shalokech b'rshus mocherhu. If we said that her bed is in his house, let's say she bought a Sealy Patrick, whatever that special bed, it's in his house, but it's her bed, she paid for it. So we said she's migureshes, but normally we say kelev shalokech b'rshus mocherhu, that's the buyer is trying to buy something, but it's in the store still. So how can you say that she's divorced? It says Gemara shamas mina. We see from here kelev shalokech b'rshus mocher kana lokech. It seems to be that there is a kinyan, namely that even though her bed is in his house, there is still a kinyan of the get, and that seems to be a shtekol chedesh. Says the Gemara, not necessarily, we can't necessarily learn that from here, 12 lines down. Lo tzricha digvo asar. Maybe the bed is taller than 10 tefachim. Says the Gemara, who cares? Va'ika makom kare, the feet of the bed are resting on the ground. So who cares if the mattress itself that she's resting 11 tefach, who cares? Doesn't matter. It's still resting on the ground. Says the Gemara, makom karlo kapti. And she fascinating answer that even though the bed is resting on the ground, if the top of the bed is above 10 tefachim, the din is that we don't care, and therefore she would be divorced. We had said that if the husband throws the get and it lands in her lap, it lands in her basket, she is migura. I think cheka actually doesn't mean her lap. I think it means her chest, like she catches it or it falls on her body, whatever the case is, or in one of her baskets. The halacha is migureshes amai. Why would that be the case? After all, we just learned this din a couple of lines ago of kelach shalokech b'rshus mocherhu. She's in his house, so even if she catches it, even if it lands in her purse, it doesn't matter. She's still in his house. Says the Gemara, 5 answers. Answer number 1, no, there was a basket hanging on her, and that is not considered to be in his house. The same answer, that there was something hanging on her, she had it like slung over her shoulder. It's tied to her, even though it is resting on the floor. So let's say she has like a security strap that's like tied around her wrist so that her purse can't get stolen, and her purse is resting on the floor. He throws it in, she's still divorced. Says she's sitting down in such a way where the basket is resting between her legs. Maybe she's squeezing it to hold it between her legs, whatever the case may be, then she'd be divorced. The 4th answer, a third of the way down. The husband sells baskets for a living. And if the husband sells baskets for a living, they're all over the house, and therefore her having one is still considered to be hers. She'd be considered to be divorced, and we're not concerned about the concern of kelev shalokech b'rshus mocher. Answer number 5, and the one that will get a little bit more attention, is Rav Yochanan, 3 lines before the wide lines. Rav Yochanan Amar, why is it that she's divorced? If he throws it into her lap or into a basket, after all, the concern of kelev shalokech b'rshus mocherhu, says the Gemara, Rav Yochanan Amar, makom cheka kanuila, makom kalsa kanuila. When she catches something with her body, it's as though she owns that spot. And if it lands in her basket, it's as though she owns the basket. As says the Gemara, Amar Rabba, my time at Rabbi Yochanan. What's the reason why Rabbi Yochanan holds that way? So says the Gemara, Lafi she'ein adam makbid lo al makom cheka v'lo al makom kalasa. What kind of a jerk of a husband are you that says that you own the space that a woman catches a get in your house? You're a big jerk. That's got to stop. That's not acceptable. She can't have a purse, you micromanaging, abusive husband. What's wrong with you? Nobody functions that way. If she's holding her purse, then if he puts the get in the purse, she's divorced, it's hers. No one's makbid like that. And Tanya Namihachi, first of the long lines, there's a brisa that supports this sheet. Rav Yochanan zarku la l'soch cheka. If he threw it into her lap, or l'soch kalsa, or into her basket, or l'soch kol davar shu kekalasa, or anything that's like a basket, hareza migureshes. And of course, this strange language of kol davar shu kekalasa. What else was trying to be included here? Kol davar shu kekalasa lasu yemai. What was trying to be included by this brisa in support of the sheet of Rav Yochanan, the isuye taska the achla batamre. Even a plate that she's using to eat dates. I did this today. I went to Shouts and I had rumaki. A little plate with dates on it. So if I own that plate and I'm eating rumaki out of that hot pan, and then a husband drops a get on his wife's pan, rumaki doesn't, she's divorced. Anything that she's holding is going to be grounds for him to drop the get on her, and they will be divorced. This brings us to the Mishnah, 3 lines into the wide lines on Ayin Ches and Aleph. Let's continue. If a person, a husband, is dishonest and he says, "Oh, here's your star chov." Oh, or she found the get behind her husband, and then when she picks it up, she reads it and she sees, "Uh-oh, my husband clearly is trying to divorce me." Not a good way to find these things out. Says the Gemara, "Eino get ad sheyomer hagitech." It's not a get until the husband says, "This is your get." Nasan biyada v'hiyashana. Let's say that he placed it in her hand while she was sleeping. This is really not the way to do things. This is like, it's not normal. But again, we use halacha as like the extreme so that we can learn the basic dinim. Interestingly, we know that Adam is muad la'olam, right? We know from the Bavas that if a person kicks something and breaks it at night, they're held accountable. So maybe she should also be divorced while she's sleeping. No? Isn't it the same thing? You're responsible what you do with your hands when you break things. Why aren't you responsible what you receive in your hands while you're sleeping? Says the Gemara, no dice. Ne'ora Korav, she woke up and she read it. The halacha is eino get ad sheyomar lo hagitech. Doesn't matter. Says the Gemara halfway down, ki omar lo hagitech my have. Well, I don't understand. She picked up, you said the get was a star chov and she's holding it now. As she's thinking it's a star chov, she then learns it's the get. She's holding it already. Now you say hagitech after you're late to the party. This flow of events does not work. If she picks up the get thinking it's a star chov, or if she picks up a piece of paper from behind the husband thinking that it's just a random piece of paper, and only after she reads it does she realize that in fact it's not a star chov, it's a get, adding the word hagitech now, you're late to the party. Says the Gemara, that doesn't work. After all, no different than the case of Havalei, Chali Gitech Mel Gabe Karka. If a husband says to the wife, "Sweetheart, don't love you anymore. Go pick up that piece of paper from the floor that you get. Sayonara, don't let the door hit you on the way out." That's not a divorce. Why? Because Amar Rava, Chali Gitech Me'al Gabe Karka, Lo Amar Klum. After all, the Nasan Biyada, the husband has to hand the get to her. So how can it be that in this case, adding in the lines of Hariza Hagitech after she already is holding the document? That's not how it works. So it says the Gemara, Ema sheshalafto me'achorav. Perhaps she pulled it off of the person. You know, they used to wear belts around their tunic, and maybe he tucked the get into his tunic from behind, and she just reached around and grabbed it from him. He didn't actually hand it to her. She took it off of his body. Perhaps that counts. Says the Gemara, still, shlafto nami. Even if she pulled it out of his belt, doesn't matter. That's still not fulfilling the requirements in the Chumash. Says the Gemara, you're still failing at the basic requirements as quoted in Chumash. You're obligated to do this. You got to figure it out. You're obligated to hand her the get. It doesn't work. So says the Gemara, what must be the case? Lo tzricha de arak lecharse b'shlafte. The husband turned his body so she could reach the get more easily. Now, is that considered v'nasan biyada? Yes or no? Let me take the question and raise it a couple of notches. Let's say that a husband has no arms. He's wearing a belt around. Somebody tucked her get in. He turns his hip to her and says, Hagitech, take this out of my, I can't even point. The get is in my belt. Take it. Is that enough? Says the Gemara, seemingly that qualifies for v'nasan biyada. If you stand still, not enough. If you turn your hip so that it's more easy, it's clear what you're indicating, at that point it works. Tanya Nami Halchi, the Brisa writes, Amar la kanti shtar chovzeh. If a husband says, "Take this shtar chov," oh sheshlafto me'achorav, or she pulled it from behind him, karaso v'harehu gita, and then she finds out it's her get. Eino get ad sheyomer lo hagitech divrei Rabbi. Rabbi says it's going to be a get only after the words hagitech. Reb Shem ben Elazar Omer, no, lo olam eino get ad shit lena himena. He has to take it back from her. V'yachzor v'yidnena Allah. He has to actually take it back and give it to her again, and then v'yomer lo hagitech, because it was she never got it on the terms that are necessary, which is v'nasan biyad, you have to give it to her. What about the case of sleeping? Niura, if she wakes up, she wakes up and sees that she's holding a get. Again, same two people. It's Rabbi and Reb Shimon ben Elazar. So we already saw there was a case by the Shtar Chov that it's a machlokes Rabbi and Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Here's another one by the case of sleeping. He says it's nothing without saying hagitech. Reb Shimon ben Elazar says over here, Omer, no. Doesn't matter. Until the husband takes back the get and rehands it to her with the language of hagitech, they're not divorced. It says the Gemara b'tzricha, we need both cases. We need the case where she's given the get as a ruse, where she picks up a random piece of paper, or if the husband says, take this shtar chov, and we need the case of sleeping. Why do we need both? The case where she picked up the paper thinking it was something else. The Rebbe says over there that she's divorced. Why? Adding the word hagitich. Why? Because at least she's awake to be divorced. If you're sleeping, it doesn't work. Aval nasan biyadav hilo yashana delabasi grusha. You can't divorce someone who's sleeping. Perhaps ema modi lay the Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Maybe in the case of sleeping, Rebbe would have agreed with Reb Shimon ben Elazar that the husband has to retake the get back and then give it to her again. And we eat marbafi only the second case of the sleeping case. Bahakam Reb Shimon ben Elazar to be very very mocked because she wasn't awake. Aval bahach where she was awake, even if she picked up the paper in an odd way because it was a ruse. Again, the husband said the kansi shtar chovzeh. In that case, maybe we would have thought we would have been very strict about behach. In the other case, the first case, ema modi le perhaps Reb Shimon ben Elazar would have agreed with Rabbi Tzricha. Therefore, we need both cases. And 3/4 of the way down, 15 lines from the bottom, about 5 lines above the Mishnah, the Gemara says, Amar Rava, Kasav laget v'nasan biyad avda yashan umishamarto. Got to follow this. Rava says, the husband writes a get, and he puts it into the hand of her sleeping eved, while she is being mishamarto, hareze get. But neyur, if the husband gives this get to an eved who's awake, eino get. Because he's making decisions for her that he's not supposed to be doing, and therefore he is a chatzer mishtameres to a degree. We'll question this soon, but shelo l'daita, she didn't want that. It's not a regular chatzer. When he's sleeping and she's watching and the husband drops the get, no problem, they're divorced. But here, if he's awake, it doesn't work. Says the Gemara, Yashan umeshamarto, if he's sleeping and she's watching, then hareza get amai. Why would that be the case? This guy is an eved. Chatzer mehaleches chatzer mehaleches lokana. When an eved is sleeping, you're right that an eved is considered to be property. I agree, 100%. But he's a portable chatzer. He has the status of a chatzer to a degree, but he's a chatzer mehaleches because he can walk and he doesn't sit still. And fundamentally, we have a din that chatzer mehaleches is lo kana. And if you want to say yosh and shiny, the person sleeping is different because after all, he's not moving, that can't be. If this person is ever going to be mahalech, then he's a chatzer mehaleches. Then even if that's true by yeshiva or by amid, doesn't matter. He's lo kana. So says the Gemara, when is it that we have the case that if a husband gives a get to an eved while he's sleeping and the Isha is standing over and watching that they're divorced, only the hilchasa bekafus. That's only true when he is handcuffed down. Why? Because then he's not mehalechas anymore. Can't stand up. He's done. This person is not bechatzer mehalechas. So therefore, when a husband gives a get to an eved who's sleeping and he's kafus, he's handcuffed to the floor, so it's not good optics, but it does actually work for the din of get. He's not a chatzer me'aleches anymore. The din of chatzer me'aleches is not inherent in the person; it's inherent in the metzias. So if he can walk, chatzer me'aleches lo kana. But if he's buckled down, then chatzer me'aleches. He's not a chatzer me'aleches anymore. He's a regular chatzer, and then they're going to be divorced.
Crazy.
Yeah, I mean, we're not used to people being property. We're not really used to that. It's not like there's something true in our era, so we're not really fully adjusted to it. But it is in fact the din. It's odd, but it's the din. Next case, 10 lines from the bottom, new Mishnah. Ayin Chesed says the new Mishnah. Let's say a husband is standing in a public property and he throws the getter. Karov law if it's closer to her megureshes. Karov law in a megureshes if it's closer to her, the divorce closer to him, they're not. Mechsa megureshes ven megureshes if it's literally exactly equidistant from person to person. The din is we don't know or makbid on her in both directions. Then the Mishnah adds that this is true v'chein le'inyan kedushin. That means if he tries to throw a ring to her, and he tosses it, karov la they're married, karov la they're married, karov lo they're not married, mechsa we're not sure. And let's give the example of the case of chov where this might actually apply. Says the Gemara, Amar lo bal chov, a person says, Zrok li chovi, throw me my money, v'zarkulo, and he throws the chov. Karov lemalve, if it's close to one person, zacha malve. Karov lelove, if it's closer to the baruch lo v'chayv, he's still obligated to pay because he hasn't paid yet. Mechsal mechsa, if the shtar chov lands equidistant to the two people, dinish nehem yachloko. Well, you really better hope this guy's got a good arm. He has to throw it exactly to the right spot, and then he's benefiting from being yachloku, 50-50. We don't know. So he has to only give half of the money that he owes to that person. That's a great move, by the way. That's a great move. The big machlokas. How do we define close? Is close a proximity question? Is close a conceptual question? This is a machlokas in the Gemara. So it says the Gemara answer number one. Amarav arba amos shela zeu karavla. Her 4 amos are hers. Arba amos shela zeu karavla. The 4 amos closer to him is perfect. Hechidami mechsa mechsa. How does mechsa mechsa work? Amarav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak kigon shahaya shneim omdin ba arba amos. What if they're standing exactly 4 amos apart, and their 4 amos perfectly overlap with one another, and the get is dropped between them? So says the Gemara, that would be the case of mechza al mechza. That's not true. Let's see who got there first. Namely, if I get there first, I'm kona that dalet amos first. So let's say these are my dalet amos, and these are your dalet amos. If I'm here first, and then you walk close enough to me that our dalet amos overlap, nobody cares that you're there. I got there first. If I'm the woman and I got there first, and you drop the get, we're divorced. So says the Gemara, why don't we just see who got there first? If you want to argue that they got there at the same time, that's impossible. There's no possibility. That's not the case. Somebody got there first. Somebody. Even if they're walking toward each other, somebody's dalet amos got there first. That's what the Gemara says. It says the Gemara, we're talking about something else. We're talking about exactly 8 amos apart from one another. Top of Ayin Ches days. The Gemara says, "V'get yotze me arba amos shalom l'dalet amos shalom." So he throws the get. There's 8 amos between us. Let's just do the math. It's about 12 feet, maybe 15 feet. He tosses the get. Imagine like a roll of paper flipping in the air. It rolls and bounces, and it lands on the line of my 4 amos into your 4 amos. That's the case of mechza al mechza. Says the Gemara, "Agid bey." I don't understand. He should still be connected to this get, and they should not be divorced. Rashi, second line on the page. It still is in its property a little bit, and Rashi highlights beautiful Rashi, descriptive fully of the husband's responsibilities to discharge this thing from his hand. You can't hold half of it in your hand and half of it in her hand and be divorced. Get it out of your hand. So too over here. If the get is on the 50-yard line, straddling my dalet amos and hers, the din is they should not be divorced. Says the Gemara, Ella, it must be that something else is going on. What's the case of mechza al mechza? We're not talking about proximity. We're not talking about 4 amos or 8 amos or anything like that. It just depends what the edim say. That's where it's mechza al mechza. But in the tziyus, you're right. That means that if it is 50-50, and then they are not divorced because the husband is still connected to it because it has to leave his rishus to be fully in her rishus. So straddling the midline between me and her doesn't divorce her. It's still in my property until it's no longer in my property. Another answer. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Karov Lashaninu Afilu Mea Ama. He says, forget about 4 amos. Anything within 100 amos is hers. The Karov Loshaninu, that which is close to him, Afilu Mea Ama. If it's within 100 amos of her, she's divorced. If it's within 100 amos of him, they're not divorced. So what's the case of 50-50 that our Mishnah speaks about? Rav Yochanan gives an answer to this question. Who yachol l'shomro, v'hi eno yachol l'shamra. If we have a case where he is able to protect the space that's near him, but she's not able to, but therefore, because she can't control the space, zeu karov lo, this is closer to him, and they would not be divorced if the get fell there. If she can protect the space and he cannot, zeu karov lo. And if, says the Gemara, a quarter of the way down, if the case is that 2 people are able to be shomer, and both of them are able to protect the space, or neither of them can, that's when we reach the case of zehu mechza al mechza, namely, Rav Yochanan is defining this as the capable and responsible party. If the space in which this falls is a space that he can control and she cannot, then you can throw the get all you want, she will not be divorced because she can't control the space. She needs to have some level of shmirah. And therefore, if you throw the get there, they won't be divorced. If it's a space where she can control it and he cannot, then she's divorced. And any other iteration would be mechza al mechza. And they said to Rav Yochanan, we actually heard this in the name of Rav Yonasan. Rav Yochanan said, wow, Yadin Chavrin Bavloi, this Babylonian friend of ours, namely Rav Yonasan, he knows the Frushe Kiyai Taima. He heard the same thing that I heard. That's amazing. That's what they must have taught in Bavel. Rav Yonasan was now in Eretz Yisrael because Rav Yochanan lived in Eretz Yisrael. But Rav Yonasan made Aliyah, and that is where Rav Yochanan bumped into. Tanya Namihachi, a brisa to support this, third of the way down, heading to the bottom of the page. Ayin Ches Amid Beis. The brisa writes, Rabbi Eliezer Omer Kol Shu Karav Lot Milo, anything that's closer to her than to him. Uva Kelevu Natalo, and then a dog came by and grabbed it from the ground. So let's get the case straight. I throw it to her. I'm not near it. She is. I have a really good arm. I attached a rock to it to give it some weight. She's 100 feet from me. I throw it to her. It lands by her feet. A dog picks it up and runs away. So what's the din? What would you have instinctively thought? She's for sure divorced because it says Eina Megureshes. Asks the Gemara, what do you mean Eina Megureshes? Kol hechi tintere v'tezel. She has to constantly protect and go that far every time. The get has to stay in a glass box forever. No, that's not how it works. Once it lands in her Dalet Amos and she sees it, she's done. She's divorced. Elalav. That's for sure not the pshat. It must be, says the Gemara, Hachi Ka'amar. We are just about a little bit more than halfway down, a little more than a third of the way down, almost halfway down. Kol shekarav lamilo, anything that's closer to her than to him. And the dog took this in a place where he was able to protect the space. And it was a space that she could not control. Then it's not because of the dog alone, but because it was a space she couldn't control. So that's what the Gemara says. Amar le Shmuel, the Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel argues to him and says, Shinana, my sweet child, my sharp one, literally. Shinana, it should be that it's close enough to her that she could bend down and pick it up. I don't know what you're talking about shmira for. And says the Gemara, but we're very strict about this. I never want you to paskin that a woman is divorced until she picks up a get. That's the vados. I don't want to deal with Dalet Amos. I don't want to deal with 100 Amos. None of the dramatic cases that we've seen, not the Eved, nothing. I want to see it in her hand, that when you go into a Bezdin, they don't say drop it in her Dalet Amos. They put it in her hand. Yeah, they put it in her hand and you have to hand it to her and she is then divorced. Amar le Rav Mordechai le Rav Ashi, Hava Uvda Hachi. There was a case like this where somebody did drop it right by her feet, and it wasn't a case scenario where it was put in her hand. Says the Gemara about Tzurchua Chalitza. Wow, we're very makbid on this. It's all D'Rabbanan. Granted, Midoraisa, she should be fully divorced, but we were makbid on her that she couldn't do Yibum. The best way and the ideal way for a husband to give a wife a get is to put it in her own hands. That's what the pasuk means. You're right. We could darshan the pasuk as v'nasan bi'adah means shlichus. It's the eved. Yeah, there's 100 things to say. And the Gemara is like, I know we're good learners. Put it in her hand. As one of my rabbeim used to say, the worst thing you can do in a kosher kitchen is put a Talmud Chacham in a kosher kitchen. They'll come up with every svara lakula or lechumra, and they'll all be wrong. Don't put the fleshik fork in the milchik sink. Rabbi Chaim Twersky told me, you'd appreciate this, Dad. Rabbi Chaim Twersky told me that he tested our stainless steel silverware to see if it absorbed anything. Yeah, you heard this?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, he told me, Rabbi Twersky said, the house smelled horrible. His wife was so upset at him. The house smelled terrible. And he found that our silverware does not absorb anything. Unbelievable. Rav Hershel Schechter from YU has some kulas based on this because they don't absorb anything. In sharp contrast, our chalent pots do, because when I was in the Gros Kolel, Rabbi Asaf Bednarsh, an Ilui Shebe Iluyim, unbelievable Talmud Chacham. Yes, but his brain was just a oker harim, just unbelievable. He brought us a cracked chalent pot, and if you looked at the cross section of the crack pot at the bottom, at the crack pot, you could see it absorbed the darker color at the top.
But not from directly, there's a pot. If you have some sort of access to some like crazy precision scale, they will measure the Leos weight. The pot became heavier after having cooked it. That's the way I heard the story.
From Rabbi Twersky?
Yeah.
I spoke to him directly.
Not so, but it was a different story.
Oh,
it was not stainless steel silver.
Oh.
I didn't hear from directly. That's the way I heard it.
Fascinating.
What you're saying about the chalent pot.
Yeah.
But by precision.
But porcelain, that material, China, whatever the material is much more absorptive than, yeah. Certainly. Even though there's a sharp enamel on there, the poskim say that Yaakov Newberger from YU said when I first got married, I had all these fancy dishes people got for us for our wedding that we never use. And he said, if there's a sheen on them, you don't have to even be tovel them because there's an enamel on top. And not everybody says that way, but certainly if you are tovel them, it's without a bracha. Okay, fine. Let's continue. At the two dots, halfway down, a little bit more. V'chein l'inyan kedushin, our Gemara had said, our Mishnah had said, v'chein l'inyan kedushin. What did that mean? That if there's something all the rules, the Dalet Amos rules, or we don't know if it's Dalet Amos, but Karov Lo Meguresh, then she's married. Karov Lo, then she's not married. Mechza, it's confusing. So the Gemara says over here that we apply this din to Kiddushin as well. Lost my spot. Here we go. V'chen l'Kiddushin, Amar Ravasi, Amar Rav Yochanan. Gittin amru v'lo l'davar acher. It only applies by get, and it doesn't apply by anything else. Says the Gemara, what are you talking about? How can you say it doesn't apply by anything else? Our Mishnah says Kiddushin. Hey, Rabbi Abel Ravasi, can you read V'chein le'inyan Kiddushin? It says we do apply these rules of Karov Lo, and Mechza. Says the Gemara, Shain Yasim d'chsiv Yotzvayisa. Kiddushin is different because there we have a pasuk that specifically includes it to the rules of Karov Lo and Mechza. But in general, not that way. Says the Gemara, still not correct. V'chein le'inyan achov. We had said in our Mishnah that by achov the rules of Karov Lo, and Mechza also apply. What was the quote from our Mishnah? That Zrok li chovi, a man says, "Throw me my chov, Zark lo." They threw it. Karv l'malve, if it's close to the malve, zacha halove, then that should say malve. Karv l'love halove chayev. That if it was closer to the person who was a love, then he's still chayev to pay because he hasn't paid yet. So says the Gemara, that is a kasha, because we see that we do extend it beyond the world of Kiddushin and Gittin. It's also by Chov. Says Gemara, Hacha b'mayaskin, in the case of Chov was different. Ukimta, says the Gemara, 12 lines from the bottom, Damar lei, Zrok li chovi b'ti pater. Says, no, I'm changing the language. It's not just Zrok li chovi, but I add the word b'ti pater. So it's no longer similar to the cases that we've been discussing. Says Gemara, Hachi, if that's true, Ma'alameim Pashat, the regular rules should apply of Karov Lo and Karov Lo. It's different language. Lo tzricha damar la Zrok li chovi b'toras Gittin. Says the Gemara, maybe he said, I want you to throw it to me just like you would a get. Says the Gemara, if that's true, he made a qualification that the rules should extend to get. That's the guy's decision. That's what he said. That's what he wanted to say. Says the Gemara, still, why wouldn't it work? Of course it will work. Says the Gemara, I might have thought, I'm trying to trick you, and really it doesn't work. Kamash Malan, that if you say, Zrok li chovi b'toras Gittin, we apply the regular rules of Karov Lo, and Mechza. First of the very long lines, Amar Rav Chizda, get biyado, Mashicha biyado. There's a get. I'm with Michael on this one. Puts the get in her hand, but there's a string attached to it that he's holding on to. It's like the coin trick from like Tom and Jerry when we were little kids. Not to quote Mari McComas from television, but there was such a thing, no? Something like that. Okay. What do we do in this case? Rav Chizda says, if he's able to really pull and it will come back to him, that's Indian giving. Just do your job. Give the get. Stop with all the tricks. Stop. If you don't want to divorce her, go to couples therapy. If you want to divorce her, stop holding onto the string. Just let go. If the string would, let's say, it just would tear or whatever, if they wouldn't get divorced, says the Gemara, Migureshes, then in fact the Nesina was considered valid. Ask the Gemara, my taima, why is this true? Dvarim Pshutim, says the Gemara, but in krisus fileka, that's not called krisus. You're still holding on to the get. That's not krisus. But here the Gemara seems to be using the word krisus in a very literal way. We need a cut, a severance between you and the get. Amar Yehuda, Haisa Yada Asuya Kikatafris, if her hands were held out in a slope. So her hands are not held this way, her hands are held downward, where if you put the get in, they'll roll off of her hands. So you were Vinasan Biyada, but her hands were not gripping, her hands were sloping. So how do we look at that? The Zarkula, you threw it to her. She's not divorced. My taima. Amai, says the Gemara, why not? Because Hakinafil, it fell. I'm sorry, says Gemara, Amai, why not? Hakinafil, she should be divorced because it's still within her Daled Amos, she should be divorced. Says the Gemara, but it never rested. Says the Gemara, doesn't matter. B'tigrash me'avira de arba amos. Ooh, wow. Okay, now we're getting lumdish. Says the Gemara, but it's in the airspace of her Daled Amos. Okay, forget about hitting the ground. It's just in the airspace. So would she be divorced if the get travels through her airspace? Let's say he's a real chacham. It's a paper airplane. He gives a nice toss. It flies right by her. Are they divorced? What about the avira? Says the Gemara, maybe from here we can learn the following. Tifshot, perhaps we can infer from here. The boy Rebbe Lazar, a question that Rebbe Lazar asked. He had asked, Arba Amos Shamru, Yeshlan Avir or Einlan Avir. The Dalet Amos that apply by a get, does it include the airspace or does it not include the airspace? Says the Gemara, Tif Shute Einlan Avir. We should assume from here that the Avir is not going to be kolate. Why? Because Eini Megureshes when it falls out of her hand. Says the Gemara, Hacha b'mayaskinan be'omedes al gabe hanahar. her hands are sloped, but her hands are over the river. So if they fall out of her hand, it's le'ibud. That's what the Gemara says, me'ikar le'ibud kai. And therefore, the avir in that case for sure is not going to, because it's not avir over the ground. But maybe, just maybe, it's possible that the avir can work to divorce her. We'll stop right here, pick up at the very top of Ayin Testament off tomorrow night in person. Wishing you all a beautiful night.